There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a conference room when a lawyer stops reading and lets a sentence sit exactly where he placed it. I sat in that quiet on a Tuesday afternoon in March, in a glass-walled office on West End Avenue in Nashville, Tennessee, watching my cousin's face change in stages. First confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to fear. My grandmother had named me, and only me, as the sole trustee of a fund my cousin did not know existed, a fund my cousin desperately needed in that exact moment. My cousin had spent 19 years telling anyone who would listen that I was the one member of this family who could not be trusted with money. My name is Imogen Faircloth. I am 41 years old, and for the last 16 years I have worked as a guidance counselor at a public high school on the east side of Nashville, Tennessee, the same city where I was born and raised. Let me take you back to how a woman my whole family considered financially careless ended up holding the one document that could save my cousin's daughter's future. It quietly rewrote everything this family had ever assumed about who could actually be trusted. I grew up the younger of two granddaughters, in a family that talked about money constantly, and honestly almost never, the way a lot of families do. My grandmother, Louisa Faircloth, had raised two sons on a school teacher's salary. Along with a small rental property, she managed herself for 30 years. By the time I was born, she had quietly become the kind of woman who understood exactly where every dollar in her life had gone. My cousin Georgina was 3 years older than me, the daughter of my grandmother's other son. From as far back as I can remember, Georgina was considered the practical one, the granddaughter who could be handed responsibility without anyone worrying much about the outcome. I was considered something else entirely, almost from the start. I chose a college major in psychology nobody in my family fully understood, took a job in public education that paid modestly and predictably, and never once expressed interest in the stock market conversations that dominated our holiday dinners. Georgina, meanwhile, worked through most of her 20s in something she called wealth management, and though nobody in our family ever quite understood what that meant, they understood the confidence with which she said it. Confidence, in my family, has always been mistaken for competence a little too easily, and nobody seemed to notice how often that mistake got made, year after year, gathering after gathering. The pattern started small, the way these things usually do, one quiet exclusion at a time. When my grandmother's rental property needed a new roof, the family held a meeting to discuss financing. I was not invited, on the grounds, my uncle said later, that I would not understand the terms of a home equity loan. When my grandfather's modest life insurance payout needed to be divided and reinvested, Georgina ran the numbers for the whole family. When I asked one clarifying question about the allocation, my uncle laughed and said, gently but pointedly, that numbers were not really my department. I did not push back that first time, and I did not really push back for years afterward. Pushing back would have meant admitting how much that particular kind of dismissal actually cost me, every single time it happened at every single gathering. What none of them knew, because I never mentioned it at a single family dinner, was that I had kept a detailed personal ledger since my first real paycheck, tracking every dollar I earned, spent, saved, and invested. I wrote it all in a plain green notebook, bought at a drugstore the same month I got my first apartment. I did this quietly, out of a habit my grandmother herself had taught me one summer, back before anyone had decided I was the impractical one in this family. She used to say, sitting across her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, that a person who writes down what they actually spend rarely lies to themselves about what they can afford. I took that sentence more seriously than almost anything else she ever told me, and I have never once stopped believing it, even on the hardest days. I remember one specific afternoon especially clearly, the summer I turned 15, when my grandmother sat me down at that same table, with a shoebox full of receipts and a spiral notebook between us. She told me the receipts belonged to her from the previous 3 months, and she wanted me to sort them into categories before we added anything up together. I asked her why she didn't just do it herself, since she clearly already knew where every dollar had gone. She said something I did not fully understand until years later, that knowing where your money goes and being able to explain it clearly to someone else are two entirely different skills. Most people in our family, she added quietly, had never bothered learning the second one at all. I spent 3 more summers after that one doing the same exercise with her, a little more of it each year. By the time I left for college, I could read a bank statement the way other girls my age read magazines, quickly, and without any real anxiety about what I might find there. My grandmother had not always been the careful woman I knew growing up, or at least that is what my father told me once, years later, over coffee at her funeral reception. She had married young, he said, to a man who spent freely and explained little. She had learned her own discipline the hard way, sorting through unpaid bills after he left for a job 2 states away, one that never quite materialized into anything permanent. She rebuilt her finances slowly, on a teacher's salary, in a rented house with 2 small boys. By the time she bought the rental property years later, she had already decided, privately, that she would never again let confusion about money decide anything important in her life. I did not know any of this as a teenager, sorting her receipts into neat little piles. I only understood it decades later, sitting in that same funeral reception, finally hearing the story behind the woman who taught me. Georgina never once sat at that table with us, not because she wasn't invited, but because she always had somewhere else to be. A summer job, a boyfriend, a trip with friends that seemed, at the time, considerably more interesting than an old woman's shoebox of receipts. I never resented her for it back then. I simply assumed, the way you assume things as a teenager, that whatever she was doing instead must matter more. Georgina managed the family's shared financial matters, in the years that followed, with a confidence that rarely invited questions, partly because she discouraged them so effectively. When our grandmother's rental income was pooled with a small family investment account, after my grandfather's death, Georgina reported the returns each Thanksgiving. She always used broad, reassuring terms in a tone that made asking for specifics feel like an accusation. I noticed, over the years, that the numbers she reported rarely matched what I could roughly estimate myself, using nothing more than public information and basic arithmetic. I said nothing, because saying something would have required a level of confrontation I was not yet ready to start, not with a family that had already decided which of us understood money. My grandmother noticed things too though she rarely said so directly, not in those years. She would call me sometimes on a Sunday evening, ostensibly to talk about my students or my garden. Somewhere in the conversation, she would ask an oddly specific question about an account statement or a tax form, phrased casually, as though she had simply been curious. I did not understand at the time that she was quietly testing what I actually knew, comparing my careful, unglamorous answers against the confident, vague ones Georgina gave at family gatherings. I understand it now, looking back, as the early groundwork for a decision she had not yet told anyone she was making, least of all me. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think this part matters to say plainly before I go any further. Have you ever been the quiet, careful person in a room full of people who assumed confidence and competence were the same thing? If that sounds familiar to any part of your own life, tell me about it in the comments below. I think these stories land differently, depending on which role you have played in your own family, and I genuinely want to know which one was yours. All right, let me get back to the year everything actually started to shift. My grandmother's health began declining seriously about 8 years ago, not dramatically, just the slow accumulation of small losses that eventually add up to something significant. A hip that never fully healed. A memory that occasionally misplaced a name it had known for decades. I visited her most Sunday afternoons during that period, bringing groceries and sitting with her while she worked through crossword puzzles she pretended still challenged her. Georgina visited less often those years, though she called frequently, always with updates about investment opportunities she thought our grandmother should consider. Opportunities that somehow always required moving money through an account Georgina personally managed. I never accused my cousin of anything, not once, not even privately to myself in any serious way, because I genuinely did not want to believe what I was slowly beginning to suspect. Families build entire architectures of denial around exactly this kind of suspicion, because the alternative, actually confronting it, threatens something much larger than a single disputed transaction. I kept bringing groceries. I kept sitting through crossword puzzles. I kept my own quiet green ledger, updated faithfully, containing nothing more dramatic than my modest teacher's salary, and my own modest, careful savings, entry after entry, year after year. My grandmother passed away 6 years ago, in late autumn, after a short final illness that gave the family enough warning to gather, but not enough time to feel prepared. The funeral was held at the same small Methodist church where she had attended services for 50 years. The reception afterward was held at Georgina's house, since her home was the largest, and, as she pointed out more than once that week, the most appropriate for hosting relatives from out of town. I remember standing near the dessert table that afternoon, listening to my uncle tell a story about our grandmother's frugality, framing it as an endearing eccentricity, rather than the disciplined philosophy it actually was. The initial will reading, held about 3 weeks after the funeral, divided my grandmother's modest estate in fairly conventional terms. The house was to be sold and split between her 2 sons. A handful of specific personal items went to grandchildren, and a smaller, separate trust account had terms the attorney described only briefly. He noted it would remain dormant until a specific condition, unspecified that day, was eventually met. Nobody pressed for details in that meeting. Grief has a way of making people accept vague answers they would otherwise have questioned. And besides, the amount involved seemed modest enough that nobody assumed it mattered much. Georgina, in the years that followed, continued managing what remained of the family's pooled investment account, the one established after my grandfather's death, and continued reporting warm, general updates at holiday gatherings that discouraged specific questions. I continued teaching, continued counseling teenagers through their own family confusions during the school day, and continued keeping my green ledger, several editions deep by then, each one filled with the same careful, unglamorous handwriting. I got married during this period to a kind, unremarkable man named Terence who worked in municipal water management. We built a small, steady life together in a house I had saved for 9 years to afford, long before we ever met each other. Terence and I met at a mutual friend's barbecue, the summer I turned 30. One of the first things I noticed about him was how little he seemed to care about impressing anyone with money he didn't have. He drove the same sedan for the entire decade I knew him before our wedding. When I mentioned once, early on, that I kept a detailed ledger of every dollar I spent, he did not laugh, the way a few other men I had dated over the years had laughed. He asked, instead, whether he could see it sometime. When I finally showed him, months later, he studied it for a long while, in a kind of quiet respect I had not expected from anyone, let alone someone I was only beginning to fall for. We built our entire marriage, in a lot of ways, around that same quiet respect. We split bills evenly, discussed large purchases before either of us made them, and treated money as something ordinary to talk about, rather than something to perform confidence around at dinner. My work as a guidance counselor gave me a strange kind of front-row seat to how differently families handle exactly this same dynamic, year after year, student after student. I have sat across from teenagers whose families praised one sibling's business instincts while quietly assuming the other simply wasn't built for numbers, almost always without any real evidence behind either assumption. I learned, over 16 years in that office, that confidence is one of the easiest things in the world to mistake for competence. This is especially true inside a family that has already decided, long before any of the facts come in, which child gets to be the capable one. Georgina's own life, during this same stretch of years, took on a different shape entirely, one that looked considerably more impressive from the outside. She and her husband bought a larger house in a nicer part of town, took vacations that showed up afterward in carefully curated photographs, and sent their daughter Junia to a private school. The tuition, I remember thinking privately, seemed difficult to reconcile with what I understood of Georgina's actual salary, though I never once said so out loud. I noticed these things the way you notice weather, without acting on it, because acting on it would have required a conversation, one I still was not prepared to start with anyone in this family. I remember one particular trip especially clearly, a 10-day vacation to Italy Georgina posted about extensively, the same summer her husband's landscaping business had, according to my aunt, gone through a noticeably slow season. I did the rough arithmetic in my head at the time, the way I always quietly did, and the numbers did not comfortably add up. Not without either significant savings I had never heard mentioned, or some other source of money nobody in the family discussed openly. I said nothing about it then, the same way I said nothing about most things involving my cousin's finances. I told myself, repeatedly, that it truly was not my business to question how another adult chose to spend her own money. I understand now that a small, quiet part of me was also simply afraid of being wrong, of raising a concern and discovering that Georgina had some perfectly reasonable explanation. That, too, would have been one more piece of evidence that I really did not understand money the way she did. Junia, meanwhile, grew into a bright, watchful girl who reminded me, more than once, of myself at that age, careful around adults, quick to notice things nobody else in the room seemed to catch. She used to sit next to me at family gatherings sometimes, when the adult conversation grew too loud or too boring for a girl her age. She would ask me quiet, specific questions about my job, about what a guidance counselor actually did all day, about whether I liked it. I always answered honestly, and I always noticed, though I never said so, that she seemed to listen to my answers more carefully. More carefully, in fact, than most of the adults in that family ever bothered to. The comments continued in the meantime, the same familiar refrain, delivered at holidays with the same familiar lightness. Georgina mentioned once, to a cousin's spouse who had not heard it before, that I had always been the impractical one in the family, sweet but hopeless with anything involving real numbers. The kind of person, she said, who probably still balanced a checkbook by hand. She said this at my own 35th birthday dinner, in front of 12 relatives, and I laughed along with everyone else, because that particular laugh had become, by then, a reflex I performed almost without thinking about it at all. Here is one specific comment I want you to hold on to, because it becomes important later in this story. At my nephew's christening 4 years ago, Georgina told my aunt, within my hearing, that she sometimes worried about who would eventually handle our grandmother's remaining affairs responsibly. Some family members, she said, simply were not built for that kind of pressure. She did not use my name directly. She did not have to. Everyone in that room understood exactly who she meant, including me, standing 3 feet away. With a glass of lemonade, I suddenly did not want to finish anymore. I want to tell you about one more thing from those years, something that happened at work rather than at home. I think it explains part of why I never fought back, the way people sometimes expect. I once counseled a student, a junior named Priya, whose older brother had spent his whole life telling their family she was the disorganized one. He, meanwhile, was supposedly the reliable one everyone could count on without question. 6 weeks into working with her, I discovered she kept a meticulous planner nobody in her family had ever bothered to look at, a level of discipline her brother had never actually demonstrated himself in any documented way. I remember thinking, driving home that evening, how easily a family can decide who someone is, long before that person ever gets a real chance to show them otherwise. 3 months ago, everything that had been quietly accumulating underneath these years of comments finally came due, all at once, in the ordinary, unglamorous way most financial crises actually arrive. Georgina's husband had cosigned a business loan for a friend's restaurant venture 2 years earlier, a venture that failed quietly, and then loudly. It left Georgina's family responsible for a debt, considerably larger than their regular income could absorb. On top of that, Junia's college tuition deposit was due in 6 weeks. At a private university, Georgina had promised her daughter years earlier, back when the family's finances looked considerably more solid than they currently were. I found out about the loan situation the way I found out about most things, in my extended family, secondhand, from my aunt. She called me on a Wednesday evening, sounding more rattled than I had heard her in years. She explained that Georgina and her husband were facing a real possibility of losing their house. She said the tuition deposit was genuinely in question. The family's shared investment account had somehow, through a series of decisions my aunt could not fully explain, lost far more value than the market alone could reasonably account for. What I actually felt hearing that news surprised even me, honestly, because it was not the satisfaction I might reasonably have expected after all those long years of quiet resentment. It was something closer to a very old, very tired kind of sadness, the specific sadness of watching a fear you never wanted to confirm finally confirm itself anyway, whether you asked it to or not. I did not feel any satisfaction standing in my kitchen that evening, listening to my aunt's voice shake over the phone. If anything, I found myself hoping there was some explanation that would make the numbers make sense after all, some detail nobody had mentioned yet. 2 days later, my uncle called our family's estate attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man named Simon Ardsley, who had handled my grandmother's affairs for over 20 years. He asked whether there was any way to access additional funds before the tuition deadline arrived. Mr. Ardsley, according to my uncle, went quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then he said there was, in fact, a dormant trust never touched, the same one mentioned briefly at the original will reading, and that its specific activation terms had finally been met. I received my own call from Mr. Ardsley the following morning, while I was grading a stack of student essays at my kitchen table. I remember setting down my red pen very carefully when he asked whether I could come into his office later that week. He told me, in the same careful tone he must use for every difficult conversation, that my grandmother had established a private trust 7 years before her death, funded steadily from her rental income. She had named me, specifically and by name, as its sole trustee. Her instructions required it remain confidential, he explained, until a family financial emergency, defined precisely in the document itself, actually occurred. I asked him more than once whether he was certain there was no mistake, because nothing in that sentence matched anything I understood about my own place in this family. He assured me there was no mistake, that my grandmother had visited his office alone, without any other family member present, and had been remarkably specific about her reasoning. He was not yet authorized to share that reasoning in full, he said, until our scheduled meeting the following week, the meeting where Georgina, as the family member requesting access to trust funds, would also need to be present. Terrence, watching me hang up the phone that morning, asked what was wrong, and I remember struggling to explain it, because nothing was technically wrong at all. I had simply spent so many years building a private identity around being the family's quiet disappointment that a piece of unexpected trust felt, for a moment, almost harder to absorb than another dismissal would have. I did not sleep especially well during the 6 days between that phone call and the meeting itself. I found myself, more than once, taking my old green ledgers down from the closet shelf where I kept them, paging through years of careful, unremarkable entries. I kept wondering what exactly my grandmother had seen in me during all those Sunday phone calls that made her trust me with something this significant. Terrence found me at the kitchen table one night, well past midnight, surrounded by open notebooks going back almost 2 decades, and he asked, gently, what I was actually looking for in all of them. I told him I honestly did not know yet, only that I felt I owed it to my grandmother to understand her reasoning before I ever sat across from Georgina again. Here is something I think about often now, and I want to ask you directly, because I suspect some of you have lived a version of this yourselves. Have you ever discovered that someone believed in you far more than your own family ever let you believe in yourself? I would genuinely like to know, so tell me in the comments below. I think that particular kind of discovery changes something permanent in how a person carries themselves afterward, and I am still working out exactly what it changed in me. Now, let me tell you what actually happened in that conference room on West End Avenue. Georgina arrived 12 minutes late, visibly stressed, wearing the kind of composed, slightly brittle smile people wear when they are trying very hard to project confidence they do not currently feel. She greeted me warmly enough, mentioned something about traffic on the interstate, and took the seat across from me at the small round conference table. She was clearly still assuming, based on everything our family had always assumed, that whatever this meeting involved would ultimately run through her judgment rather than mine. Mr. Ardsley opened a manila folder, the same kind my grandmother had apparently favored for every important document in her life, and began by explaining the basic structure of the trust. It had been funded gradually, over 7 years, from rental income my grandmother had deliberately never mentioned to anyone. It currently held just under $200,000, more than enough to cover both the loan shortfall and Junia's tuition, should the trustee decide to release funds for those purposes. Georgina's face brightened considerably at that number, and she began almost immediately, outlining a plan for how the funds should be allocated. She spoke with the same fluent confidence she had always used at family gatherings, the confidence nobody in our family had ever quite learned to question out loud. She was midway through a sentence about restructuring the loan repayment schedule when Mr. Ardsley gently interrupted her and explained, as plainly as he could manage, that all trust decisions rested solely with the named trustee. The named trustee, he said, was in fact sitting across the table from her. I want to describe the exact several seconds that followed, because I think they matter more than almost anything else in this entire story. Georgina looked at Mr. Ardsley, then at me, then back at Mr. Ardsley again, and I watched an entire lifetime of assumptions rearrange themselves behind her eyes in something close to real time. She asked, carefully, whether he meant I was simply present as a formality. He told her, just as carefully, that I was not a formality, that I held sole discretionary authority over every dollar in that account, exactly as our grandmother had specified in writing. Georgina turned to me directly then and asked, in a voice considerably smaller than the one she used at family dinners, why our grandmother would possibly have chosen me for something this significant. I did not answer immediately, partly because I was still absorbing the question myself, and partly because I wanted to choose my next words with more care than I usually allowed myself in conversations with my cousin. I told her, as plainly as I could, that I did not fully know the answer either. I suspected, though, that our grandmother had simply been paying closer attention than either of us realized, for longer than either of us realized. Mr. Ardsley, at that point, opened a second folder, one containing my grandmother's own handwritten notes. She had dictated them to him during a private meeting, one she had insisted on keeping confidential from the entire family. He read aloud, at my quiet request, a single paragraph my grandmother had apparently composed specifically for this moment. She had spent years quietly comparing the financial habits of both granddaughters, not through accusation or suspicion, but through simple, patient observation. The paragraph explained. She had concluded that the granddaughter everyone considered impractical was, in fact, the only one who had never once asked her for money and never once needed rescuing from a bad decision. That granddaughter had also never once reported a number that did not match what she could independently verify herself. Georgina sat very still through that entire reading, her hands folded on the conference table in front of her. When Mr. Ardsley finished, she asked, quietly, whether our grandmother had known about the investment account losses before she died. Mr. Ardsley said he could not speak to that directly, since it fell outside what my grandmother had documented. He noted, gently, that the trust's activation condition had been drafted with unusually specific language about family emergencies stemming from mismanaged shared accounts, language he had found notable enough to remember, even years later. I asked for a short recess at that point, mostly because I needed a few minutes away from the table to think clearly. Mr. Ardsley agreed readily, stepping out to make a phone call, while Georgina and I sat alone in that glass-walled office, for the first time in longer than either of us could probably remember. She did not look at me directly at first, staring instead at the folder of my grandmother's handwritten notes, still open on the table between us. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost every trace of the confidence I had spent 19 years learning to defer to, without ever once really questioning why. She told me, haltingly, that she had genuinely believed, for most of the last decade, that she was the more capable one. Not out of malice toward me specifically, she said, but simply because that belief had been handed to her so consistently, by our whole family, that she had never once thought to question it herself. She admitted, quietly, that the investment account losses were larger than she had told anyone. A series of increasingly risky decisions, made over several years, had compounded into something she no longer knew how to explain honestly, even to herself. I asked her, as gently as I could manage, why she had never once asked me directly what I actually knew about managing money. We had grown up, after all, in the same house for entire summers, learning from the same grandmother. She thought about that question for a long moment before answering, turning her wedding ring slowly around her finger the way I remembered her doing as a nervous teenager, decades earlier. She said she supposed she had never wanted to ask, because some part of her had always known, quietly, that the answer might complicate a story, one she had told herself for a very long time. It is easier, she admitted, to simply believe the version of yourself that everyone around you keeps confirming than to ask a question, one that might require you to build an entirely new one. She said, after a long pause, that it had genuinely never occurred to her. Somewhere along the way, she had simply absorbed the family's collective assumption about which of us understood numbers, the way people absorb the temperature of a room, without ever consciously noticing they have done so at all. When Mr. Ardsley returned, I told him I had reached a decision, one I had actually been quietly forming for several days before that meeting ever happened, not just in that short recess alone. I authorized the trust to cover Junia's full tuition deposit immediately, since her enrollment had a hard deadline, one that could not wait for a longer family conversation. I authorized a partial payment toward the cosigned loan as well, structured as a formal repayment agreement between the trust and Georgina's family. It had clear terms, clear documentation, and a modest but real interest rate, the same kind of structure my grandmother had used for every arrangement in her own life. Georgina asked why I had chosen a formal loan structure, rather than simply covering the debt outright, since the trust clearly held more than enough to do so without any repayment plan at all. I told her, honestly, that I thought our family had spent decades treating money as something that moved invisibly between people, without documentation or real accountability. I told her I did not want to repeat that same pattern now, just because I finally held the authority to do something differently. I thought my grandmother would have wanted exactly this, a real structure, written down, the same discipline she had spent her whole life quietly trying to teach us both. I want to pause here again, briefly, because I think this next part deserves its own space, rather than getting folded into everything else happening that day. Watching Georgina absorb that explanation, I understood, for the first time, that being trusted with something significant does not actually erase years of being dismissed. It simply hands you a different set of choices about what to do with the years that come afterward. I am still deciding, even now, exactly what I want those choices to look like, for both of us going forward. The formal paperwork took another 2 weeks to finalize, during which Georgina and I spoke more honestly than we had in probably 15 years, mostly about small things at first. Our grandmother's actual habits, half-remembered stories from childhood summers, the specific way she used to fold receipts into her recipe box, instead of throwing them away, a habit neither of us had ever really discussed with the other. Georgina admitted, during one of these conversations, that she had genuinely started believing her own confident version of events over the years. The version where she managed money well and I simply did not understand it. Untangling that belief from reality, she admitted, had been more disorienting than she had expected it to be. One evening during those 2 weeks, Georgina called me, close to 10 at night, sounding smaller than I had ever heard her sound in my life. She asked whether I thought our grandmother had been disappointed in her. I told her honestly that I did not know. I had never once seen any bitterness in my grandmother's private notes only patience and a kind of careful hope that things might eventually turn out differently for both of us. Georgina was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then she said she wished she had asked our grandmother more questions while she was still alive to answer them. I told her I understood exactly what she meant, more than she probably realized. Junia's tuition deposit cleared on time, and she started her first semester 6 weeks ago, calling me directly once to thank me, in a slightly formal, careful voice that suggested her mother had coached her on exactly what to say. The gratitude underneath it sounded genuine enough regardless. I found myself, after that call, sitting quietly at my kitchen table for a long while, thinking about how strange it felt to finally matter to this family, in a way I had spent so long assuming I never would. Junia called again 3 weeks later, unprompted this time, no coaching evident in her voice at all. She wanted to tell me about a course she had enrolled in, an introductory economics class she said she was taking partly because of me, though she laughed a little admitting it, embarrassed by her own sincerity. She asked whether I would be willing to talk to her sometime about how I actually built my own savings over the years. Not the trust, she clarified quickly, but my own habits, the ones nobody in the family had ever really asked me about before. I told her I would love nothing more, and I meant it more than I expected to, sitting there afterward with the phone still warm in my hand. I drove out to see her over her fall break, just the two of us. We met at a small coffee shop near her campus, rather than at any family gathering where other relatives might overhear or weigh in. She asked sharper questions than I expected from a 19-year-old about compound interest, about the actual difference between saving and investing, about why nobody had ever explained any of this to her plainly before college. I answered as best I could, the same patient way my grandmother once answered my own questions, at her kitchen table. Somewhere in that conversation, I understood something important. Whatever else this whole ordeal had cost our family, it had also handed me a chance to be for Junia what my grandmother had once quietly been for me. Georgina's family sold their larger house shortly afterward, downsizing to something considerably more modest. Georgina described it to me, without any of her old brittleness, as the first financial choice she had made in years, one that actually matched what her own life could honestly support. She invited Terrence and me over for dinner at the new place last month, a smaller house, with a kitchen table not unlike the one our grandmother used to sit at. Over a meal she cooked herself, she asked me, almost shyly, whether I would consider showing her how I actually kept my ledger, page by page, the way our grandmother once showed me. I said yes, and we spent that whole evening at her new kitchen table, going through 3 months of her own receipts together, sorting them into categories the way I had learned to do at 15. She asked more questions in those 2 hours than she had asked me in the previous 19 years combined. I found myself, more than once, thinking of my grandmother watching us from somewhere, finally satisfied that both her granddaughters had learned the same lesson, even if one of us had needed considerably longer to arrive at it. Georgina's husband, a quiet man named Gilbert, had always stayed politely out of these family conversations. He called me himself a few weeks after the paperwork was finalized, something he had never once done in all the years I had known him. He thanked me plainly, without any of the flourish Georgina sometimes brought to conversations like this. He told me, honestly, that he had spent most of his adult life assuming financial competence was something. You either had it or you didn't, the way, he said, some people simply have perfect pitch. Watching me work through the trust terms with Mr. Ardsley, he said, had made him reconsider that assumption for the first time in years. I told him I appreciated the call, and I meant it. I found myself thinking afterward, though, about how much easier this entire situation might have gone. Had anyone in this family ever spoken half this plainly to me, at any point over the last 2 decades? I still keep my green ledger, the newest edition now, updated every week, in the same careful handwriting my grandmother once taught me at her kitchen table. I added a new page to it recently, tracking the trust's formal loan repayments from Georgina's family. It is structured exactly the way my grandmother structured her own affairs for 30 years, with real terms and a real schedule, and nothing left invisible between the people involved. 6 years of being quietly dismissed, and one long conference room conversation on West End Avenue taught me a handful of things worth passing along, exactly as clearly as I can manage to put them. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from being underestimated politely, year after year, by people who never once raised their voice about it. Nobody in my family ever called me stupid, or careless, or irresponsible, not directly, not in so many words. They simply, quietly, never once handed me anything that required trusting me with it, which somehow felt harder to name, and harder to argue with, than an actual accusation ever would have. Being excluded from something is never actually proof that you were unqualified for it. It is only ever proof that someone else decided, often without much real evidence, that you were. I spent nearly 2 decades believing my family's assessment of my own financial competence, largely because nobody around me offered a different one. I understand now that their assessment was built almost entirely on confidence, rather than on any actual accuracy. I think about how easily that exclusion could have gone the other way too, if my grandmother had never bothered to look closely enough to notice the difference between us. Confidence is loud by design, and quiet consistency asks for nothing, which means a family has to actually choose to look for it, rather than simply waiting for it to announce itself the way confidence always does. I try to remember that now, at my own job, whenever a student's quieter sibling sits across from me. They often look like they've already decided, quietly, that their own effort doesn't count for much in their family's eyes. Quiet, consistent habits rarely announce themselves the way confident performances do. A family that rewards the second kind will often overlook the first kind for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime, unless something eventually forces the comparison into the open. I kept my ledger for over 20 years, without a single person in my family ever asking to see it. I understand now that its value was never really about anyone else noticing at all. It was about the discipline itself, and what it quietly built in me over time. Sometimes the person who has been paying the closest attention to you your entire life is not the one making the most noise about it. My grandmother spent years testing what I actually knew, without ever once telling me she was testing anything at all. I did not understand the full weight of those Sunday phone calls until years after some of them had already happened, and by then she was already gone. I wish, sometimes, that I had understood what she was doing while she was still alive to see me understand it. I could have thanked her properly at her own kitchen table instead of only working it out afterward in a lawyer's office. I try to tell my own students something close to this now, when I notice them quietly proving themselves to someone who may never fully see it in time. Pay attention to who is actually paying attention to you, I tell them, because sometimes that person is planning something on your behalf, long before you ever have any reason to suspect it. Being handed real responsibility does not erase the years you spent being underestimated, but it does hand you a real choice about what kind of person you become once you finally hold it. I could have used that trust to humiliate my cousin in front of our entire family, and some quiet, tired part of me will admit that thought crossed my mind more than once during that difficult week. I chose structure instead, because structure was the actual lesson. My grandmother had spent her whole life trying to teach both of us, in her own quiet way. I think about that choice often, honestly, more than I expected to when I first made it. There was a version of that conference room where I said nothing about repayment terms at all and simply released the full amount, no questions asked. In that version, Georgina would have felt, for the rest of her life, that she owed her entire family's stability to a cousin she had spent 2 decades dismissing. Some petty, tired part of me can admit that version had its appeal, in the moment, sitting across from her stunned expression. I chose the harder version instead, the one with real paperwork and a real schedule. I understood, even in that recess, that humiliating Georgina would have cost me something too, a version of myself I did not actually want to become, no matter how satisfying the alternative might have felt for exactly one afternoon. A family that finally sees you clearly, even decades later, is still worth the relationship it offers you afterward, imperfect as that relationship inevitably remains. Georgina and I are not close, in the way people mean when they use that word casually, but we speak honestly now, in a way we never once managed during all those years of holiday dinners. I have come to understand that honest is worth considerably more to me than close ever actually was. We hosted Thanksgiving together this year, for the first time in either of our adult lives, splitting the cooking between her new kitchen and mine. We compared notes on a green bean recipe our grandmother used to make every single year, without ever writing down the exact measurements. Junia came home from college for it, sitting between us at the table. At some point in the evening, I noticed her watching Georgina and me talk. It was the same way she used to watch me answer her quiet questions at family gatherings years earlier. She asked me later, washing dishes together at the sink, whether her mother and I had always gotten along this well. I told her the truth, that we hadn't, not for a long time, and that some things simply take an entire family emergency to finally sort themselves out. I keep a photograph now, on the small shelf above my own kitchen table, of my grandmother sitting at hers, decades ago, a shoebox of receipts open in front of her. Terrence took it one Sunday afternoon, years before any of this happened, back when I still thought of that ritual as simply a strange, private habit of hers, rather than the quiet architecture of everything that eventually followed. I look at it sometimes while I update my own ledger on a Sunday evening. I think about how much of what actually mattered in my life she built at that exact table, one careful entry at a time, long before anyone else in this family understood what she was doing. If any part of this story reached you, I would like to ask you something specific, something that has nothing to do with trust funds or family money at all. Think of the person in your own life who has been quietly, consistently reliable for years, without anyone in your family ever quite naming it out loud. Maybe it is a sibling everyone assumes will simply handle things, without anyone ever asking whether handling things has actually cost them something. Maybe it is a parent, or a friend, or even yourself, quietly proving something to a family that has not yet thought to look. Tell me about that person in the comments below, and maybe consider calling them this week, because I suspect they have been waiting far longer than they would ever admit to you directly. I think about my grandmother often, especially on Sunday evenings now, when I sit at my own kitchen table, with my ledger open in front of me. The same green cloth cover, the same careful handwriting, the same quiet discipline she handed me one summer afternoon so long ago that I barely remember learning it at all. I understand now, fully and completely, that she gave me something considerably more valuable than any trust fund that afternoon. She gave me a quiet habit, one that eventually became the whole proof of who I actually was, long before anyone else in my family was ever ready to see it clearly. Some mornings, before the school day starts, I sit in my car in the parking lot for a few extra minutes. I review the same green ledger, out of habit more than necessity now, the engine still running against the early morning cold. I think, in those quiet minutes, about how strange it is that the quietest thing I ever did, kept faithfully and told to no one, turned out to be the thing that mattered most. It took me most of my adult life, honestly, to fully understand that. And one very long, very ordinary Tuesday afternoon in March, in a quiet glass-walled lawyer's office, to finally believe it completely.